Don't go anywhere. This case isn't over yet. Hit that like button, comment your theories, and don't forget to subscribe. You're about to witness a case that still haunts the Caribbean, and the mystery is far from solved. It's a warm evening in Aruba, 2005, and the sunset casts a beautiful orange glow over the island. But for Natalie Holloway, 18-year-old American tourist, the evening would end in a way no one could have predicted. It was May 30th, 2005, the night before Natalie was set to fly home to Alabama after a school trip. She and her friends had been celebrating at a popular nightclub, Carlos and Charlie's, a local hotspot for both tourists and locals alike. The evening had been filled with laughter, music, and youthful excitement. However, as the night wore on, something sinister was unfolding, something that would forever alter the course of her life and spark one of the most infamous cold cases in modern criminal history. Natalie Holloway had left the nightclub around 1:30 a.m. with a few new acquaintances, two young men, Joran van der Sloot, a 17-year-old Dutch student, and his two friends. They left the club together, but as the clock ticked on, Natalie vanished. No one saw her leave, no one saw what happened next. By the time her friends realized she was gone, it was too late. The island was asleep, and so began the frantic search for a girl who would never be seen again. The morning after, panic set in. Natalie's mother, Beth Holloway, was the first to call the police after she found out her daughter had failed to return to their hotel room. What followed was a hunt that would last for days, weeks, and years. The initial investigation was chaotic. Authorities on the island were overwhelmed and quickly realized they were dealing with a much larger scale of disappearance than they had anticipated. Joran van der Sloot and his friends initially cooperated, offering accounts of where they went, but their stories quickly started to fall apart. It didn't take long before investigators started to look at van der Sloot as the primary suspect. The young man had a checkered history, a student with a history of lying, inconsistent stories, and unexplained behavior. The police were left with nothing but inconsistent testimonies and a feeling that something wasn't right. As the search continued, Beth Holloway was relentless. She was determined to find her daughter, to get answers, and to bring her home. Meanwhile, the islanders, who had initially opened their hearts to the tourists, were starting to feel the weight of the tragedy. Aruba, a place known for its hospitality and serene landscapes, had turned into a place of suspicion and grief. The locals and tourists alike now feared that the once peaceful island was hiding a dark truth. Then came the chilling discovery: Joran van der Sloot was not telling the truth. Over the next few weeks, new details surfaced about his involvement. Details that painted a clearer picture of what might have happened that night. Police began questioning him in detail, but his answers were as evasive as ever. It was becoming clear that something happened that van der Sloot was desperate to hide. He had blood on his hands, and the world was about to find out. But then came the biggest twist. Van der Sloot's alibis began to crumble. His story about driving Natalie around the island didn't match the evidence. And then, in an act of desperation, van der Sloot offered a shocking confession. But that confession would lead to more questions than answers. When they opened the locked room at the police station, they found something that changed everything. The truth about Natalie Holloway's disappearance seemed as elusive as the island breeze. Days turned into weeks, and the initial investigation was flooded with dead ends and false leads. But in the depths of the desperate search, one name continued to emerge: Joran van der Sloot. Van der Sloot had been a prime suspect from the very beginning. His inconsistency, his nervousness during interrogations, and the alarming gap between his testimony and the available evidence made him the centerpiece of the investigation. Yet, despite numerous attempts, he had maintained his innocence. But as the world watched, the case began to unravel, and van der Sloot's lies began to take a darker turn. The young man's story changed time and again, and he contradicted himself at every corner, even during police interrogations. First, he said he dropped Natalie off at her hotel. Then, he claimed he had left her at the beach. In fact, his alibis were so thin, investigators were left questioning his every word. What didn't add up were the discrepancies in the timeline, the missing hours that nobody could explain. Van der Sloot had been with Natalie for a period of time no one could account for. And what followed was the discovery that sent shockwaves through the investigation. Joran van der Sloot had lied about the events that night. It was only when Van der Sloot was faced with new evidence, key witness testimonies, and a mounting pressure from law enforcement that he began to crack. Investigators had secretly obtained crucial CCTV footage showing Van der Sloot's car in areas of Aruba where he had claimed to never have been. But the turning point came when Van der Sloot gave an unexpected confession, one that only deepened the mystery and the suspicions of his involvement. He admitted to having been alone with Natalie the entire night. But what he said next was even more chilling. He described how Natalie was drunk, disoriented, and vulnerable when he offered to give her a ride back to her hotel. His words were carefully chosen, full of contradictions, but he painted a picture of events that felt rehearsed. What was the truth? What really happened that night? Miller's gut told her that Van der Sloot's confession wasn't the whole story. His calmness was disturbing. He had the demeanor of someone who had done this before. Something in his voice suggested that he knew more than he was letting on. Miller, driven by the pressure of finding Natalie and discovering the real story, became obsessed with the idea that Joran van der Sloot was hiding a much more dangerous secret. The investigation hit a breakthrough when a mysterious informant came forward. The person who chose to remain anonymous claimed to have witnessed a shadowy figure near Natalie's last known location, an area far away from where she had been expected to be. This informant described a car driving quickly toward a desolate area on the island's outskirts, matching the description of the vehicle that Van der Sloot had been seen driving. It became clear that Van der Sloot had not only been involved in Natalie's disappearance, but there was also a more sinister level to the story. He had deliberately misled authorities for months. This breakthrough would lead to a massive discovery, one that connected Van der Sloot's ties to a larger web of corruption and criminal activity on the island. As the evidence mounted, the investigation expanded to include not only the Holloway case, but also other cases that seemed to have disturbing similarities to Natalie's disappearance. Was Van der Sloot's involvement just the tip of the iceberg? The night before a major breakthrough in the case, Miller was called into the Aruba police station late in the evening. A cryptic message had arrived, and it changed everything. If you want to find out the truth about Natalie Holloway, you need to look beyond the island. Miller read the message again, her heart racing. It was clear that the case had just gone deeper than she could have ever imagined. But what did this mean? And more importantly, what was she missing? The investigation into Natalie Holloway's disappearance had taken a turn for the worse. As Detective Claire Miller and the team delved deeper, the pieces were finally beginning to fit. But the truth they uncovered was far darker than they could have imagined. The informant's cryptic message had led them to a critical realization. Joran van der Sloot's involvement in Natalie's disappearance was only one part of a much larger web of lies, deceit, and cover-ups. The man who had seemed to be a singular, isolated figure in the case was merely a pawn in a game much bigger than anyone could have foreseen. In the weeks following the explosive revelation, a new lead emerged from a confidential source in the Caribbean. This source claimed that Van der Sloot had been involved in a black market operation, smuggling drugs, weapons, and people between the islands. The authorities had long suspected organized criminal activity tied to human trafficking across the region, but this was the first real connection that linked Van der Sloot to such illegal operations. It was becoming clear. Van der Sloot had been part of something far bigger than just the crime of the missing young woman. His ties to international crime syndicates were now undeniable. But how did it all tie back to Natalie? Miller's instincts told her there was more to the story. Van der Sloot wasn't just trying to cover up a murder. There was an underlying motive that had to do with power, money, and fear. Someone else was involved, and it was time to find out who. Just as the investigation seemed to be heading toward a breakthrough, Joran van der Sloot was arrested again, not for Natalie's disappearance, but for another crime. This time, it wasn't just about the lies he told. It was about the murder of another young woman, a case that had gone unsolved for nearly 6 years. When Van der Sloot was arrested, Miller received a tip-off that the investigation into Natalie's case had just taken a sharp turn. Deeper layers of deception were being uncovered, and as Miller began to piece together the new information, she realized that van der Sloot wasn't just a lone wolf. He was operating with help. The murder of another woman was the direct result of his connection to a dark, hidden network. Natalie's disappearance was not an isolated incident. There were other women who had crossed paths with van der Sloot and never made a home. With the investigation heading down a dark and dangerous path, Miller uncovered a shocking secret. Joran van der Sloot had a secret accomplice, someone from within his inner circle. Someone who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes and had a greater influence than anyone could have imagined. The accomplice had gone undetected, manipulating everything from the beginning, including van der Sloot's alibis and the false evidence he provided to mislead investigators. When Miller uncovered the name of this accomplice, someone who had been embedded within the law enforcement system for years, it sent shockwaves through the investigation. The accomplice had worked with law enforcement officials, and their role in the cover-up was far more involved than anyone had anticipated. The investigation into Natalie Holloway was not just about uncovering the truth about her disappearance, but about exposing a systemic corruption that had allowed these crimes to go on for years without detection. Miller was finally able to piece together the full story, but it came with a gut-wrenching realization. Justice for Natalie Holloway was never going to be simple. The webs of lies, deceit, and manipulation ran so deep that uncovering the entire truth would take more time than anyone anticipated. As Miller sat down with Beth Holloway, Natalie's mother, and revealed the findings, the weight of the truth settled in. The justice system had failed, and so had the very system that was supposed to protect the innocent. But the fight was far from over. The case was far from closed, and even as van der Sloot sat in jail, the true scale of the cover-up began to come into focus. Joran van der Sloot had manipulated the system, but his ultimate downfall was coming, and no one would escape the fallout. But as Miller walked out of the room, she received a final tip-off. Someone close to the investigation, had just disappeared. The last remaining witness who had seen Natalie Holloway before she disappeared had been silenced, and the question on everyone's mind was, who else was involved?